the Ethics of UBI seminar at Freiburg at the University of Freiburg. I'm Karl Widerquist, the seminar leader, and we have a guest today, Philippe van Parijs. We've read and discussed his work in his absence, and we have the great luxury today to have him here to respond to our discussion of it. And we do have at least one person who is responding to it, who has prepared comments, and that is Dritan. Dritan, would you like to take it away?
Okay, so you want me to start now?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Well, having read Philippe van Parijs' book on basic income, I'd like to provide some discussion points on particular fragments which I thought could make for a good debate for the class. First of all, I am not of the opinion that the first region on chapter 5, by which you aim to relativize free riding, really meets its goal, given that one's wealth consists of him or her having been emotionally invested into achieving a certain level of success. It is not simply about money anymore. It comes down to a moral dilemma of not letting able people live off your work because it feels like exploiting. And to some degree, to me, it seems like the saving for old age. You reduce consumption today to increase consumption tomorrow. And the same could be applicable to this. You work harder today to have more leisure tomorrow. And my question in this is, could fairness be a cover for self-serving behavior as we see self-interested individuals behind the veil of ignorance? So this is my first point, and I will proceed further.
No. Let's take your points one at a time, because I think this is the point that I think more than just you would like to respond to. So that means now, so I'll have Philippe respond to that point, and then I'll take other questions and comments from anyone attending but only on this point. So we're staying on this point of, is the question of, Van Parijs' quest for fairness actually, could it be a mask for I don't know, the parasitic self-interest? Is that summarizing it fairly, Bertrand?
Maybe.
Okay, or for taking advantage. Okay, Philippe, go ahead.
Yeah, I can respond to that, but it would be useful also to get structure in the discussion. If you could just mention, Britain, the other points you want to touch, and then I'll answer to this question. You just mentioned the headings and without developing, which.
So the second point is funding of UBI and their implications, and I provide some empirical evidence on that, and I asked some questions about it, and then I discussed towards the end of chapter 5. I argue your point of view that having aggregate level of happiness, it doesn't make sense as a long-term objective. And I discussed something about it. Yeah, so basically that's it.
Okay. Very good. So yes, as far as I remember, so the beginning of that chapter is a sort of ad hominem, a set of ad hominem arguments. And so some people say, well, justice really is a matter of fair reward for labor, or it's a matter of reciprocity, it's a matter of to each according to his or her effort, possibly also the emotional involvement, whatever, and so some sort of merit. And so what we do is that even for people, sorry about that, I should have disconnected, even for people who believe in this sort of conception of justice, there may be good reasons to adopt the idea of a basic income, if only as a second best in the real world. And so that's the purpose of the beginning of chapter 5. Now, this is not an answer to your question, because you are saying, well, isn't there then a point, at least in one version of these arguments, or based on what labor deserves, isn't that there one version, at least, that should be treated more carefully and more convincingly than we do in that part of the chapter? Now, the arguments you use, and of course it is present in the debate, is and people who will say, oh, come on, fairness, this is really something I'm entitled to because I made the effort to produce it. I made it with a view to making some savings or even some immediate consumption, but you mentioned the case of saving for old age, and now someone is going to take that away from me. And the response to that is that, in my view, so a fair system must be one in which all taxation is anticipated, can be anticipated by the people, so that people can't say, oh, well, I use this I save this for my old age, and now you are taking it away from me. No, people know in advance that part of what they are earning will be taxed away from them in order to serve some purposes. This is, of course, the case now, and it is the case with any sort of taxation. So people can't say, I'm outraged because money is taken from me. There can only be outrage if you adopt some sort of entitlement conception of justice, libertarian, Nozick, or where you say, well, whatever is the product of my labor is something that I own. And of course, I regard that conception as totally implausible once you say all the implications of it. And so basically, what, and I'll just stop there, and by giving this as the general background of this discussion. And so, as you might have perceived in the book, but also in my other writing, I have, I wouldn't say some fascination, but some attraction to a libertarian view, because I attach great importance to personal freedom. And so the central purpose of my earlier book, Real Freedom for All, consisted in trying to reconcile these two elements that to me are fundamental in for a conception of a just society, that is equality and freedom. And the way in which I did so, or tried to do so, was by saying, come on, libertarians, what you are talking about is not really freedom, because it's not real freedom, and because it's just a formal freedom without, where you give people certain rights without the capacity to exercise them. So we must take freedom seriously, but it must be real freedom, and it can be combined with equality. It's not against equality, because equality is just a criterion of distribution, and what this distribution must be about for the sake of justice is precisely this real freedom, not to equalize it strictly, but to give it the highest sustainable for the people who have least of that freedom. And so therefore, once you have that as by way of background, as a fair distribution, then you say, well, people can't complain about being taken, being the victims of free riding, of being exploited. They all get a fair share of what we all inherited, and then their work, they're safe, and of course, if they work, they'll have a higher income. If they're safe, they'll have a greater wealth than other people will have. That's all fair, but it must be against the background of a fair distribution of resources as defined by real freedom for all. So that's basically my answer. So there is a point, I mean, there are 2 points that are correct in that sort of challenge to my view. One is that freedom is important, And the other one is that people should be entitled what they can legitimately expect, and therefore the taxation for this purpose, for the purpose of basic income or any other purpose, must be anticipated, must be possible for people to anticipate it, and then take their decisions to work, save, invest, train, etc. in that light.
Okay, now, first of all, my hand is up, you all can't see it because you don't need to, but, so I could respond to this issue as well. First of all, Dritan, he gave, a long answer to your question. So I'm guessing you might have some follow-ups. I'll go to you first. You have a follow-up on his answer.
Okay, so I would extend it a little bit further, and it relates to my second point that I wanted to raise. So funding a UBI would require that there is a huge increase in taxes, and especially to the rich. And as Van Parijs already answered to that, people would have to anticipate it. Well, as regards to the deadweight loss generated from increase in taxes, there is a huge amount of wealth that would go to no one. And there is one question that pops into my mind right now. Is this ethical for all this wealth to go to no one? From this point, to some sense, we are limiting our societies and our economy's potential. Moreover, we see that the size of the government would increase. Should we, or under what circumstances, ought members of a society consent that the government takes care of their economic needs, as in a UBI, for instance? Then, from the sense of compensation, UBI requires not only that a malice or injustice occurred in the past, but also that injustice resulted in material deprivation for the next generation. If, for instance, on the contrary, the injustice resulted in material improvement for his or her own descendants, one can still disapprove the preliminary injustice and at the same time fail to justify any claims for compensation. Therefore, a procedural approach would make more sense in this case. It seems that UBI is a consequentialist policy that induces blame, at least from those on the better off side. And in my view, we may yet have another reverse societal insider-outsider problem and a potentially cancel culture. A rule governance wouldn't allow for much blame since the rules are the same for people, for each and every one, and therefore the outcomes would be seen more just because the same rules did apply to everyone in the same way. And therefore, to some degree, I anticipate that the outcome-oriented governance would discriminate high achievers by merit. And from an individualistic point of view, the imposition of such external standards of fairness would be rejected. So yeah, that's my response.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Dritan. There is a lot there, a lot to respond to. So let me clarify perhaps first some things that may be side issues. First, you said the introduction of the basic income would involve a high increase in taxation. Of course, this is not necessarily the case, and that is, it depends on the level of the basic income, and it depends on what it replaces. And as you might have seen, especially in our chapter 7, and so we are in favor of the introduction of a modest basic income, so-called the partial basic income, that would replace some of the existing social transfers without worsening the situation of any of the poorest households. And at the same time, it would go hand in hand in a country like Germany or like our country, Belgium, France. It would go along with significant reform of the personal income tax system, so that the basic income would replace the exemptions, the general exemptions that apply to all the lower layers of taxation, so that the net cost in terms of higher taxation for some groups, possibly through personal income taxation, but also in other ways, eco taxes or whatever, would not need to be a huge increase. Of course, if you say 1,200 euros per month and per person for everyone, or like in the Swiss referendum, 2,300 Swiss francs, and that ends up with 39% of GDP. Of course, then it would be a huge increase, but it depends on what level and what it replaces. And certainly, for the sort of reform I propose, it couldn't be characterized as a huge increase. There would be some increase on some of the higher incomes, but not a huge one. Another important point, I think, is that yes, it would have an impact on GDP. So you could say part of which could be characterized as deadweight loss, as the immediate impact on work and investment incentives of the change in the tax rate, both because of an income effect and because of the fact that everyone will enjoy this basic income as a basic security, and because of a substitution effect related to the modification in the marginal tax rate. So there will be a deadweight loss in this sense, but this is of course only part of the expected impact on GDP, because even more important is the impact via the formation of human capital, where some people argue, or because of the lower incentives due to higher marginal tax rates, people will train less. But of course, you have the Zuckerberg argument for basic income that say no, it's sort of venture capital for the people. That is, it will involve a systematic encouragement for further training, for the acquisition of skills, because it will enable everyone at every point in life to take an internship and to reduce working time in order to further train. So about all these effects, we can only speculate, but of course, part of the economic case, in my view, quite strong in favor of basic income, relates not to the immediate impact on labor market participation for the people at the bottom because of the suppression of the unemployment trap, but relates to the long-term impact on human capital through providing it's adequately coupled with lifelong training. So that, and the question, well, is there or is there not going to be a significant negative effect on GDP per capita? And therefore, are we, as you suggest, are we not handicapping our society, preventing it from achieving some of its objectives? And so what I'm saying, even the impact on GDP, we shouldn't say too quickly on the basis of narrow-minded and myopic analysis of the labor market and labor market participation. We shouldn't take for granted it would be negative. But secondly, more importantly, of course, GDP per capita only measures monetary incomes. It doesn't capture the gains that can be made thanks to well-used labor, well-used leisure, and not the leisure, so-called leisure of the unemployed, who are constantly trying to find a job and being stressed because they can't find one, but the leisure that can be taken by people in order to better look after their children, to get more involved in the community. And this is, of course, all part of what we need to look at in terms of if we adopt a consequentialist approach, and that is, it must be broader than simply the impact, the economic impact as measured by GDP. However important a concern for the GDP may remain, and not as an indicator of what is good for a society, but certainly as what we need in order to fund any public resources. We need GDP in order to tax it and use it both for pure distributive purposes, but also for public investment, for schools and all the rest. So I think that replies to some aspects of your question, but not quite to what you said at the end then about the claims that could be made by high achievers. I think, you know, with basic income, even as I think is ethically right, even a basic income at a higher sustainable level would leave quite a bit of room, some people say too much room, for inequalities. And of course, the high achievers are what is regarded as a high achiever in high achievement should not only be regarded, it is not regarded by high achievers as being purely a material thing. Being a high achiever is also making interesting scientific discoveries, starting interesting social enterprises, even if that doesn't show very much in the earnings at the end of each month. And so high achievements should not be reduced to high incomes. And on the whole, by giving the greatest real freedom to those with least real freedom, you'll enable more people to become high achievers in their own dimension of what high achievement means. That would be my way of answering the last part of your question. But it's a very rich question which touches on many important aspects of the ethical debate on basic income.
Okay, we have a handout for one of the students in class. Benedict, what's your question?
Yeah, it was a short, so my hand raised in the very beginning during Dritton's reading of his second question. When he mentioned deadweight loss and the fact that a huge amount of wealth that goes to no one, I was just wondering, aren't you, I mean, that is, as a matter of fact, happening right now. Aren't you criticizing UBI with what's already happening in the status quo? We have an enormous amount of free riding in today's advanced capitalist societies where entrepreneurs use public infrastructure but pay little to no taxes. The gig economy has stripped millions of workers of their rights, and in Germany, a lot of gig economy companies don't pay enough social contributions. Aren't you criticizing the proposed scheme with something that's already an issue today? Aren't we, isn't it switched?
Okay. Yeah, I'm also criticizing that. I mean, when I mentioned deadweight loss, I simply acquired that stance due to the wealth that is being lost, and that's a principled argument, which doesn't necessarily imposes on UBI, but also on other policies, which you already mentioned. So because the argument was about UBI, and I simply used that principle to discuss about it.
Well, I'd like to say a little more about this issue. Well, your argument, if you really want to get rid of, I think you've admitted that. Well, actually, the argument from the standpoint of deadweight losses isn't a defense of the existing system. It is. I'll make 2 points about it. One small point about it is that deadweight loss is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that everyone has enough food to eat, a safe place to sleep, proper medical care, and their other basic needs met. That is the economic problem. How do we get those out of our resources without destroying the environment that sustains us? That is the essential economic problem. A lot of economists make really no distinction between needs and wants. But really, once we solve this problem, then the rest of the economic problem gets to be, well, how many more luxuries can we get out of our environment without destroying the environment that sustains us? The economic problem should be divided into two. And if the first one causes a deadweight loss, well, so be it. Meeting people's needs is more important than getting rid of deadweight losses. But the second one is your argument isn't just a small departure from the status quo, but an enormous departure from the status quo, because there are enormous deadweight losses in the system that we have now, where we have all these giveaways to the wealthiest people in ways that monopolize them, give them market powers over other people, and hurt us all and hurt future generations in massive ways. All of those things would need to change to say, well, this is what we should do, even if that's instead of basic income. Okay, and I guess there's a third one, which is that there are also, and none of those then, even if we get to that point, so we're getting rid of all these other deadweight losses by fixing these other things, is that there is an opportunity for at least some level of basic income without a deadweight loss. And that is, one is basic income is a lump sum transfer. So the basic income itself has no deadweight loss. Everybody gets the same no matter what they do. So it gives you no substitution effect. It has income effects, but everything has income effects. It has no substitution effect, no inefficiency involved in basic income itself. Basic income, the taxes needed to ensure that basic income doesn't cause inflation, those might have deadweight losses. But there are taxes that have no deadweight loss, and those are taxes on resources and rents, things that are just sitting there. So to the extent that UBI is financed by taxes on resources and rents, it creates no deadweight loss. So it is not only, so your argument there is a market for massive reform of capitalism as we know it, and only a minor caution on basic income as proposed. Okay, Benedict's hand has gone back up. Back to you, Benedict.
So this may be a departure from the discussion that we're having right now. We may, because it delves on, you mentioned the environment, and I was going to ask a question about that. If we have somebody in the room that is, that wants to discuss the point we're doing right now.
Okay,
then feel free to,
okay, Robert, are you on the point that we're on right now? Which is a pretty broad point, I must admit.
Hello, everybody. I'm particularly interested in the history or prehistory of basic income. So maybe it's the time.
Robert, sir, is this question about the point that we're on right now? If not, we'll come back to it later.
So maybe it's better to discuss it later.
Okay, great. We'll come back to it later. Okay, Bernie, is your point on the point we're on now?
Yeah, it is. I would like to support Philippe as well as Karl. Also say hello to Philippe. It's nice to see you by that way. Perfect match. And for a simple public sector argument, one could put together Karl's argument as well as Philippe's argument. Philippe's argument is more on taxation and Karl's argument more on the expenditure, deadweight losses. And it depends on if you look at the tax incidence or if you look at the budgetary incidence. And the idea, for instance, of Tony Atkinson was to argue that if you switch from a graduated tax system financing a traditional social insurance system, with a lot of in-kind transfers, then it's easy to see if you switch to flat taxes, then you have no differential deadweight loss on the tax side. If you switch from a system with a lot of means-tested in-kind transfers towards a cash transfer, then you have a big deadweight loss decrease on the public expenditure side. Yeah, you cannot measure because it's measured in terms of utility. However, you measure utility, as Philippe said it. Yeah, if intrinsic motivation is integrated, then there is no way to measure this effects completely by GDP. But even with GDP, my arguments, and it was at the time in middle of the 1990s, also the argument of Tony Atkinson is that you will see a differential increase in wealth and welfare. My question now to Philippe is, you had the argument with freedom, and also partly, this is partly coupled to the debt wave loss argument, because I teach in my course Economic Policy in Public Choice a model of Robert Cooter, yeah, who argued that liberty may be on the one hand priceless in an authoritarian regime, and on the other hand worthless when the individuals are poor. Your argument seems to be the worthless thing, yeah, that one needs a cash transfer, basic income to overcome that poverty of worthless liberty. Yeah, if we overcome also with that the priceless liberty, which could be the fact, then Cooter's argument is then we are in trade-off region between liberty, freedom on the one hand side, however you would like to measure liberty and freedom, yeah, the degree of, and on the other hand, the degree of wealth that you may have for relatively rich and democratized societies, a trade-off between, say, income or wealth and freedom. Do you think that Cooter is right on that? Yeah? That whenever we move out of the classical basic debt weight loss paradigm, that we have this trade-off, and that the trade-off may be solved differently under different regimes in different societies? Or would you say, just like Rawls and others, that liberty is a trump and always trumps wealth increasing?
Yes, I'm not completely sure I understood you, but the trade-off you're talking about is a trade-off between the so-called priceless formal freedom that doesn't exist under authoritarian regime, and then the freedom that is worthless as long as it's not backed by sufficient wealth and possessed, mastered by individuals on the other hand. And the way in which I try to articulate that, I'm back to my book, Real Freedom for All, is that for me, a just society is a society in which people are as free as that can be. That is, in which the people with least freedom are as free as that can be. And what I mean then by that freedom is then first a minimal condition of self-ownership of something like that, which would be the formal freedom that is being violated in authoritarian regimes, but this is not sufficient. And then you need then not just wealth, because this real freedom can also be made up of access to free, efficient, or highly subsidized public services. Of course, your real freedom is increased if you have access to good public transport. It's increased if you have good schools. It's increased if you have pleasant public spaces that are not just places for sustainable mobility, but also for enjoyable immobility. All these things are part of the real freedom of a person. So it's not just a matter of individual wealth. And so what I see in a way is that you have, in a sense, a prior condition of self-ownership, but I wouldn't say that it totally trumps it, just as Rawls, in fact, in Rawls's constructions, there is a priority that is given to his first principles, to the fundamental liberties. But of course, he doesn't assert that whatever public means could be used in the service of protecting these fundamental liberties should be used for that purpose, because then nothing would be left in order to pursue the aim of distributive justice, both aspects of this second principle. So I think that formal freedom, the one that's at risk in authoritarian societies, and indeed the one that some people say is at risk in our pandemic situations because of all the additional restrictions of our freedom about having to wear a mask, having to show a pass, etc. That is about all about the formal freedom. And so I'm saying room must be made for that, but it doesn't trump the considerations that have to that relate to the real aspect of freedom. But both aspects are important. So that with Coulter's distinction, I find it interesting the way he puts it, because it's priceless on one side, worthless on the other. I mean, it's a nice play with words, but of course, I mean, this idea of freedom being worthless even is also already very present in those terms in Rawls's theory of justice, where he says there are these fundamental liberties, including political liberties, but the worth of political liberties can only be secured if you have access to means of subsistence for everyone. And so there is already this idea of freedom being worthless if you don't have adequate means. But I repeat, and so these adequate means is not only a matter of basic income, it's also a matter of access to good quality public services. I'm not in favor of transforming everything into cash.
So, okay, thank you.
Okay, Dritan, do you have, how many more points you have? Was it 3 points total or 4? So you have 1 or 2 to go. How many points do you have left to go?
One more.
One more. Okay, let's see. In that case, okay, let's go to that now, and then we'll, oh, did you have one more on this point? Yeah. Okay, oh, sorry, one more comment on this point, and then we'll get you to the third point, and then finally, after we discuss that, we'll get to the unrelated points. I got a queue of 2 of those. Okay, go ahead, Marvin.
Yeah, it's a question which is related to the financing, and what every proponent of the UBI says when it comes to financing is we're going to cut back, like it can be financed by partially cutting back on other aspects of social welfare. And my thought on this is that this could potentially be really dangerous, because if you cut back this like social welfare that was fought on for a long time to establish it, and you cut it back and introduce a UBI, then there's just one lever to control all governmental spending on social welfare. And I think it's not hard to imagine to have a very neoliberal government coming into place, like Margaret Thatcher, for example, in the past, who then can really do all the reforms that took her, like, I don't know how many terms she did to cut them back with one single law. So just there's potential of this reform, if it's not done properly, to actually really fail on the promise it gives to make society fairer. And like your thoughts on the dangers of that?
Yeah. Well, yes, it's a concern that's often expressed. And so part of the answer, of course, is that people like me don't propose a tabula rasa. And so the proposal is to have a basic income that provides this basic economic security. But its social insurance is not being scrapped, so people will keep having unemployment benefit related to their past earnings because of the social security contributions they paid into a social insurance fund. Similarly, people will have a higher pension, so a top-up pension, in most cases a top-up that will be higher than the basic pension itself, that will be related to their past career. So the social insurance benefits will keep existing. But not only that, we'll still need, with a modest basic income, say at 500 euros or so, or 600 euros in Germany, we'll still need parts of the existing social assistance system for people who live on their own in cities. It won't be enough to pay for their housing. For people who have some sort of handicap, even if they didn't have a working career that enables them to have social insurance on top of that, we need to have social assistance measure. And in many places, it will need to take the form of housing benefits, and that will remain means tested. But of course, with a total amount that's much smaller because it operates against the background of a basic income. So part of the answer consists in saying, wait a minute, this is not about scrapping everything and just having a basic income as the sole, as the only social benefit. And a second important element in the answer about the people who are afraid that at some point some government may decide to reduce dramatically the level of that basic income. Well, you must realize that we are already dependent, and the poorest, especially the poorest workers, but also the poorest unemployed, are dependent not on decisions taken by their trade union or by their employer, but on decisions that are taken by our democratic governments and parliaments. And so, for example, the level of the basic exemption, and that means that everyone pays less in taxes because of this exemption of the lower layers. That's, of course, proportionally benefits mostly low earners, but that is all decided by democratic institutions, and is currently dependent on it in the same way as the level of a basic income would be dependent on it. Of course, if we distrust democracy, if we believe that we are at the mercy of some holdup by a democratic majority at any point, well, then we can't put much trust in the economic security provided by the basic income, but we can't put much trust in much of what is going on now in our welfare states that are also dependent on democratic decisions. It's not as if the employers and the trade unions were discussing that and establishing them in isolation without any guarantee given by democratic power. So this would be my two answers to your question. So one, no one serious is proposing a tabula rasa, and two, even now we are highly dependent on democratic decisions and the stability of these decisions, just as we would be with the basic income.
Okay, so Dritan, now you go to your third point.
Okay, so this is not a question, but more of a comment, and maybe a differing opinion with Philippe van Parijs. So towards the end of chapter 5, you argued that due to people's preferences changing, increasing the aggregate level of happiness does not make sense as a long-term objective. Well, that might be true, depending on how you look at it. And you, in the beginning, described or clarified that with the GDP example. What I think is important to mention here is that humans' instincts have always been the same. Today, we build houses as a shelter. Our early ancestors found caves or other unsophisticated solutions. So any readers in anthropology, please correct me. I'd like to further relate this to Robert Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Humans have always had physiological needs, safety needs, sense of belonging needs, esteem and self-actualization needs. And in fact, what we are seeing today is simply an evolution of our needs, preferences and so on. But the genesis is still there. Based on this, and to my own understanding, it is quite the contrary. We should point at happiness as a long-term objective. And UBI may have the capacity to do that, at least as shown by the results of the Finnish experiment, where people reported that their well-being had improved. But again, we do not really know the long-term effects of it, whether countries will be able to sustain it, or whether countries with a UBI would be more attractive to migrants and whatnot. So yeah, that's my last point. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that comment. Yes, we are at the end of ethical chapter. We are not very friendly to the people who say, well, look at the basic income. It's a fantastic idea because it makes people happier. And of course, I mean, when you look at the nice little videos about Namibia and the village, and you see all these smiling people who are very happy about the money they received, I mean, all this is frankly not a very serious way of arguing in favor of a basic income. And what we are, and we look at a number of arguments that are used in order to say that structurally a basic income would increase happiness. Of course, you can't just look at the people whose income would increase or whose freedom would increase, but you should also look at the people who you mentioned before, some of the high achievers, or some of the people who were expecting to make a lot of money and then who can make less money because the high levels of taxation that are needed in order to distribute this money to other people and make them happier. So what the net effect would be, I mean, you can speculate about it, but the basic point is that we shouldn't formulate our ideal of a good society in terms of the level of happiness that it reaches. And then we refer to what we call Durkheim's paradox, where Emile Durkheim in one of his main classic books points out that there is this strange paradox between that is given by the negative correlation between what he calls the degree of civilization on the one hand and the degree of happiness on the other. And so as the indicator of the degree of the relevant notion of happiness, he takes the inverse of the rate of suicide, of what he calls sad suicide, as opposed to kamikazes and so on, who are committing suicide as part of their duty. And so he says, well, happiness so measured is in fact inversely correlated with the degree of civilization as measured in part by the degree of economic development and in part by the degree of development of equality, equal rights, respect for fundamental rights. There's a negative correlation. So what should we conclude? That we should try to be less civilized in this sense? No, he says what we should conclude is that the aim is not to make people as satisfied as possible, but to have a society that is just, that is fair, that has equality between men and women, that respect freedom of expression, etc. All these features need to be protected, even if there is no good reason that it will make us on average happier. And so we have, in fact, that part of our chapter was recently translated in French, and under the title in French we have this expression which you have no doubt in other languages, which is l'argent ne fait pas le bonheur, money doesn't make happy. And so the title that was put for this article was basic income doesn't make for happiness, and so what? And so what? So there's no strong case in favor of it, but I believe there is a strong case in terms of social justice, because of not only the greater purchasing power it gives to the more vulnerable people in our society, but because of the greater bargaining power it gives them the greater access to leisure, not only to income. And this is what makes basic income a just measure, even if it's not a measure that is making people on average happier or more satisfied with life than is currently the case.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up on this issue, and time is getting tight, so I'm going to go to the two unrelated questions we have in the queue. And the first of those is from Benedict. Go ahead. Second one's from Robert.
So, Professor van Parijs, I'd love to hear your take on UBI and a potential increase in ecological justice. When I read the chapter on free riding, I immediately had to, as an economics student, obviously had to think of the free riding behavior in terms of, ecological externalities, where we can clearly see that the richest 1% in basically any Western country behave like ecological vandals, while a broad amount of persons globally have to, suffer the consequences. And there have been UBI-esque schemes proposed for, taxing very environmentally damaging things very heavily and distributing the income from the tax levy equally amongst, members of a nation, which would incentivize ecologically sustainable behavior. And I was wondering, do you think that UBI in general or certain forms of UBI can increase ecological justice by incentivizing sustainable behavior? And what are the limits of redistribution in the fight against climate change and the environmental challenges we have in the 21st century?
Yeah, can I add to that before you answer? And that's to me, when I said before about deadweight loss, I mentioned monopolization, but I didn't mention this environment. Well, I sort of alluded to it, but the environment is the biggest source of deadweight loss in the world today. I have in my lungs right now rubber that has come off of the tires of people driving around the world. And that's not even the top 20 sources of pollution in this world. It's in my lungs right now, and yours too. And it's not priced. They do that for free. That's just one little example of source of deadweight loss. There's so much of that, and we are killing the environment that sustains us. Okay, Philippe?
Yes, good question. So we discussed that in chapter 7 when we go through the various the attitudes of the various political currents, traditions towards basic income, and then we discuss the Greens in particular. But it seems to me that there are two main aspects, and we shouldn't say, of course, too quickly that basic income and green concerns go together. But the first one, which for me was present from the very start, and when the idea came to me, it was in part for that very reason, came to me in 1982, before most of you were born. And it was the following at the time, and still to a much lesser extent, but still to some extent today, both the right and the left, in periods of high unemployment, thought the only solution is faster growth. And so we can expect further technological advance that will create structural unemployment. How do we solve that? Well, if you need only one man instead of two to produce a car, you produce two cars, simple. And so I thought this is crazy, but at the same time, I thought unemployment is a major problem. Involuntary unemployment, the fact that people, the sense people give to their lives is completely sabotaged by the fact that they can't get access to the sort of recognition that would be given by a paid job. So we can't just say, oh, well, that's not a problem, unemployment. We must be able to address it. And so what I saw basic income as was also as what was in part as a way of addressing that problem, how we could solve the problem of unemployment without relying on ever faster growth by saying, well, we'll give everyone a basic income so that the people who work too much can work less, interrupt their working time, partly in order to retrain, or work part-time, etc. And these jobs can then be full, if only on a part-time basis, because it can be combined with the basic income. It can be filled by people who are currently unemployed. And so this seemed to be a meaningful way of addressing the problem of unemployment that was ecologically sound and that was not ecologically crazy as ever further growth was. So this is to me one connection, and that remains valid today, even though this big consensus, which was completely uncontroversial, practically uncontroversial between the right and the left at the time, between the labor unions and the employers, is now, as a result of the awareness of climate change and all the rest, has now become much weaker. So that's one connection. But the other connection is related to the way in which basic income will be funded or partly funded, because the sheer fact that we distribute the income in an unconditional way rather than in a conditional way, or the sheer fact that we distribute more from the rich high polluters to the poor who currently pollute less, doesn't mean that the overall level of pollution or of CO2 emissions will be reduced. I mean, you might even expect that it may increase in some, at least in some countries or in some sectors, but it depends on the way you fund it. And if at least part of the funding, as is increasingly advocated, comes from taxes on carbon or other ecological damage, well, then of course that will help a basic income taken together with the way in which it is funded. It will make basic income also for that reason an ecologically or ecology friendly measure. But in this case, it's contingently related to the way in which it is funded, and it's not intrinsic to the basic income itself. And so there are other connections between basic income and ecology, but these seem to me the two main ones.
Okay, Dritan wants to follow up on this, so go ahead, Dritan.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something about the ecological thing that Benedict raised. The city that I live in 2017 was the most polluted city in Europe.
Which city is that?
Tetovo, North Macedonia.
Okay.
So I am too very concerned about the externalities of the polluters. But I just want to add that there is no amount of money or whatever compensation, anything given to me in a form of compensation that could, could compensate for my damaged health, for instance. So while, I mean, we can internalize externalities in other ways without having to compensate people. I mean, there isn't a one-to-one equivalence giving people money in compensation for their damaged health. So yeah.
But if I can just briefly react to that, because here is not a question of compensating the people for the damage they have suffered. It's a matter of providing incentives to do the right thing for the environment. And so by making people pay the true cost of what they consume. So if directly or indirectly you consume goods that produce a lot of CO2 and that that has as an implication taken globally that we go above the threshold of what is digestible by the atmosphere, well, we need to pay the true cost for that. And the fact that we pollute as much as we do means that other people can pollute less. And so once we pay the true cost from that, much less of that much less of that damage will be done. So whether the people who actually suffered the damage will get as a result of that the right compensation can absolutely not be guaranteed, because the sharing will be a sort of lump sum to everyone. And some people, for some reason, will not have suffered very much from the pollution, and some people will have died from it and could not even be compensated because of no longer being there.
Actually, and I should add here, actually in mainstream economic theory, if you want to eliminate deadweight loss, you have to not only have the person pay, but also have them pay the person they do the damage to. Only then do you fully internalize the effects of the transaction on all sides of the transaction. I bought something from you, and it hurts Benedict. Then we pay Benedict, bringing him in on there, and then we all then have the incentive to change our behavior given the true costs of it. If we leave Benedict out, his behavior doesn't change given those costs. Of course, it's impossible to pay everyone because a lot of people being hurt the most haven't been born yet. So we can't pay it. We have to pay people. Have to pay more than what we're giving the current generation. But that is usually when you're talking about eliminating deadweight loss, you talk about this person pays that person. Okay. Now we have one more question. We are technically out of time, but we have one more question from Robert, who has wanted to ask a question for a while though. So there you go, Robert.
Thank you. As I wrote in the chat, I'm especially interested in the debate between our guest Philippe and André Gortz, a debate which took place in the 1980s. So can you please tell us a little more about this debate? Is it still actual? As far as I know, André Gortz, long time he was skeptical about basic income. So we can't ask André Gortz, what do you think? What do you remember of this exchange of ideas and proposals?
Okay, well, that's a good last question, and also partly because André Gortz is someone for whom I had a lot of admiration, a lot of affection. I dedicated one of my books to him called Refonder la Solidarité. I visited him twice also with my wife, in one case with my children, in the house in Vonon in Champagne, where he committed suicide jointly with his wife, as you know. And our relationship started rather badly. Because he had written a piece to be published in a magazine, a left-wing magazine here in Belgium, and the authors, the editors of the journal asked me to write a comment. But I wrote my comment in the sort of I would say tradition of analytical philosophy in which I was trained, and explaining why I didn't agree with his arguments. Essentially, in that was at a stage where he was still coupling the idea of sort of basic minimum for everyone, coupling it with the obligation of civil service of about 20,000, and arguing that the liberation of people also involved that participation in what he called heteronymous work but of limited duration. And I think I even used in that paper sort of a bit of a cheeky analogy with the motto at the entrance of the concentration camps, Arbeit macht frei, and where, because part of his argument was that work, that is salaried work, paid work, and was part of what would give people freedom. And for me, the freedom, the real freedom to have access to work is very important. So I'm not denying the importance of work, but I would not claim that it is work that makes you free. Anyway, I was teasing him a bit like that, and I got a letter back saying that he said it was not the first time that people with whom he sympathized privately, this was before quite a bit before I met him for the first time, but we had only correspondence, not the first time that he discovered that people with whom one could sympathize privately behaved as des goujats, as rude people as soon as they were in public. So I apologize, because it was certainly not my intention to do so. And from then on, we really got on well. And in fact, many of the arguments he used, I found extremely congenial in favor of something that started looking more and more as time went on like an unconditional basic income, because part of his, what was central in his approach was really this defense of the autonomous sphere, that is, of the sphere of activities, including productive activities that escape both from the control from governance by the market and from governance by the state, by the public authorities. So, and I've always found also that the best way of characterizing the green tradition of political thought with respect to the liberal tradition and the socialist tradition, if there was one, was in those terms. That is, and the liberals want more market, the socialists want more state, and then the Greens want more community or more autonomous sphere. And it's André Gorz, in line with Ivan Illich, who then articulated that in the most rigorous way, and in a less sort of fanciful way than or provocative way than Ivan Illich. And then indeed, in the end, he by thinking about it, he thought, yes, the best way of making people, of protecting this autonomous sphere, of preserving them against the pressure, the enrollment, both by the market and by the state, was to give them an unconditional income, providing it was high enough. And then he sent me this letter, which I think is somewhere on the web somewhere, which ends by saying, by the way, I've just paid my contribution to my fee to Bien, to the basic income network. That was when I was the secretary of the network in the early days. And then it said, continue, which is a bit similar to someone else who André Gorz admired greatly, who is Herbert Marcuse. And once when walking in the little graveyard on Chausseestrasse in Berlin, where Hegel and Fichte are buried with their wives, I discovered a new grave, which was Herbert Marcuse's grave. And on that grave, there is just his name and then Weitermachen. And so I told Gorz that his continuer was like the Weitermachen of Herbert Marcuse. So this, as the last question, was a way of getting some anecdotes, but indeed, I mean, part of the history of a movement and of an idea is a matter of personal relations between people.
All right, thank you very much, Philippe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to all, and good luck to the Freiburg Basic Income Project, Bernard and all the others. Yeah. Bye.